As we just discussed in the last video, the importance of Mustafa Kemal for the development of the Turkish state and the Turkish Republic can hardly be overstated. Kemalism, as his guiding ideology came to be known, can be boiled down to 6 fundamental principles. And it's a political ideology that is inspired by the Western European tradition of scientific positivism in the wake of, or in the footsteps of Auguste Comte, whose basic idea can be summed up for the importance of order for progress in society. As you can see, for example, in the motto in the Brazilian flag, Ordem e Progresso, this is exactly, that's an expression of positivism as a political ideology. And it's roughly the same, it's the same principles that guide now the new leaders of the Turkish Republic. So the 6 principles of Kemalism are republicanism, populism, secularism, reformism, nationalism, and statism. And let's go into each of them briefly. Republicanism is probably the easiest to understand, and it's simply a rejection of the formerly monarchic principle that had guided the Ottoman Empire. Here you see a picture of the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, who was normally still the head of the Ottoman Empire and who was then deposed by the Turkish National Assembly. This is perhaps not so surprising that the new republic deposes the old king, that we have seen before. More momentous is the decision taken shortly afterwards to also depose the last caliph. You might remember the Ottoman sultans had assumed the office of the caliph from the Abbasid Caliphate in 1519 and had occupied the post in personal union, the post of the sultan and the post of the caliph together. And so this is, and the role of the caliph was the spiritual leader of the entire Muslim community. That's how the office was seen by and defined by themselves. So the decision now of the Turkish Republic to also abolish the office of the caliphate can be compared in its momentousness only if you make an analogy. If you think, for example, fascist Italy under Mussolini in roughly around the same time, if they had decided to abolish the papacy and the impact this would have had for Christian faith in general, and particularly for the Catholics in particular. Instead, as you all know, Mussolini entered into a concordat, into a state treaty with the papacy. So this is the approach one of the most ruthless politicians Europe has seen in the last few centuries has taken with respect to an important religious office. And that might allow you to understand the drasticness of the Turkish Republic's decision to simply abolish that office and all that came with it. And it has left a void in the popular imagination of Muslims throughout. And it was a void keenly felt already at the time. And we might come back throughout the course to the implications of the abolition of the caliphate. The second principle is populism, which is a run-of-the-mill corporatist idea that was floating around at the time in quite a few different polities. And it's the idea that the nation as a corporate body, as an almost organic body, transcends class differences, gender differences, any other divisions that could be imagined, and that therefore the organic body of the people making up the nation is in unity and is achieving social cooperation under the guidance of the state. And the emphasis given to the improvement of the lot of women, the incorporation of women into the political process, the adoption of, for example, the Swiss Civil Code in replacing previously religiously inspired civil laws and personal laws, all are expression of this principle of populism. The third principle is perhaps the most important, and is the one principle that has come to define modern Turkey, particularly in opposition to much of the rest of the Muslim world. And as we discussed in the beginning of this week, actually something that it has in common with the post-Soviet republics, and that is the principle of secularism, or laïcité, as the principle is called in French, and that the Turkish government explicitly imported from France and uses as a loan word in Turkish now. And here we see on this picture, it's the first Turkish edition, Turkish language edition of a Quran, which is a momentous achievement in a sense. It's the idea that the believers should be able to read for themselves and therefore no longer be dependent on an intermediary class of priests who will speak Arabic, which is a different language, and therefore stressing a supranational identification. So this is why this first Turkish edition of the Quran was actually commissioned by the state, by Atatürk personally, and was then distributed. And on the other side of the picture, you see a similarly important move that goes in the same direction, is the momentous decision of the Turkish government to switch to a Latin alphabet. That is a decision that was highly controversial at the time. The decision of the Turkish state in 1928 to introduce the Latin alphabet, was held by the decision taken 2 years earlier to do the same in the Central Asian Turkic republics. And what the move to a Latin alphabet indicates, it's not just a linguistic move, it's also at the same time, it removes you from the rest of the religiously inspired Muslim community that uses the Arabic script. And we see exactly the same issue resurfacing in some of the other nations where the trend towards a nationalist reinterpretation of identity in opposition to an Islamic identity has often taken the form of the script. So the principle of laïcism was not immediately included in the Constitution. The 1924, the first Republican Constitution, the 1924 Constitution still mentions in its Article 2 that Islam is the religion of the Turkish state. That article is abolished in an amendment in 1928, and it is only in 1937, so 14 years after the first Constitutional Convention, that the Kemalist principles, including secularism, are now included in the Constitution and given constitutional weight. So this gives you an indication that already, despite all the power of the Turkish revolutionaries that we discussed in the last video, this was a highly momentous and difficult and highly controversial move. And we will see these same debates in some of the other Muslim countries that we will follow in the course of this of our journey here. The fourth principle of Kemalism is reformism. And if you allow me to make a slightly far-reaching analogy, it could perhaps be compared to Trotsky's idea of a permanent revolution. It's the idea that the reforms instigated by the new rulers of Turkey in the 1920s and 30s should not stop there, that this is not a process that will stop at one point, that it's a continuous process towards ever greater modernization and development of state and society. And it's the idea that the traditional backward concepts in thought, in social organization, in institutional arrangements need to be actively overcome and combated. and that this is not a process that can be simply achieved in the course of a few reforms. So this is the principle of reformism, or as it's also called, revolutionism. It's a difficult word to pronounce. And one of the symbols of the iterations of this principle is a decision by the Turkish Republic to abolish certain types of clothing. So the traditional turbans for men, or also the traditional fez, the brimless Turkish hat that was used to be produced in Tunisia, was now abolished by the Turkish government. And as we will see later on, it actually had a very negative impact on the industry of Tunisia that used to produce these hats, but that is a side note. But you see that the Turkish state takes an active interest in trying to change very personal habits, in this case, the dress, because you believe it's the way you dress affects the way you think and the way you organize yourself in society. And that is a principle that's also then taken on in some of the other countries. For example, Reza Shah in Iran adopted exactly the same principle with respect to clothing in roughly around the same time. The fifth principle is nationalism, and that is perhaps something that is most known or is most immediately apparent when you come to Turkey, is extreme nationalism of its people and of its state. And here it's perhaps, as we discussed in the last video, it's important to remember that this is a new nation. It's a new nation coming and springing up on the ruins of a very old state, which seems like a contradiction. And this shows that the Turkish identity and the notion of a Turkish nation is not clear and it's not clearly defined. So as we can see on this photo, which shows the creation of the Turkish Historical Association, and Atatürk is right in the middle. So he again takes a personal interest in. So why would the state take an interest in the Historical Association? It should be something slightly academic and only of academic interest. But that is because the social engineering of the new republic depends on this community believing in something that is non-religious and non-ethnic. And that is the idea of the Turkish nation, which is defined officially as a non-racial definition of a group. It's linguistically based, and it's based on a common notion of history and language. And it's a good explanation or example of what Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, calls a usable past. This is a creation of a past. This is not an authentic past that really existed and was remembered by people. This is a creation. It's an artificial history writing, because it's a history that is then useful for political purpose. And we see this in many other nations as well. And if you allow me now to make a slight excursus to our fine university, Wilhelm Thomas, one of the greatest Danish linguists, who is, as you see on this photo, is one photo of himself, and the other photo shows him as one of 6 eminent scientists of the University of Copenhagen in front of our main building. He is actually the linguist who discovered how to read the earliest Turkic inscriptions. As you see in the middle of the photo, it's the transcription of the early Ogham script that Willem Thomson managed to decipher. And that was very important for this creation of a usable past in Turkish national history writing. And here on this slide, you see on the left is a recreation of some of the inscription found in front of one of the big universities in Turkey today. And on the map, you see the red dot. This is the place, the Ogham Valley in the middle of Mongolia, where these inscriptions were found, and which indicates roughly the area where the Turkic people initially originated. And as you can see, this is an important focus of identification for the Turkish history writing and nationalist agitation. the last principle is statism or etatism. And that is, again, it's not a peculiar Turkish invention. It's the idea created at the time, not created, sort of floating around at the time, and very popular, particularly in response to the enormous success that the Soviet Union achieved in its industrialization, was the belief that the state needs to take an active role in the economy, and not only regulating it, but also investing and actually running a planned economy. So it's not communism as such, but it's the belief that the state should play a very important role. And you might be forgiven for not knowing the context, this is not, the role of the government in the economy is not necessarily a communist idea. Planned economy was used, for example, by the French Republic after World War II very successfully. And again, so we see certain analogies to France here, but so etatism in the Kemalist iteration means that the state needs to take an active role, not just regulating, but investing and owning the important means of production. And this role of the state as a major investor and owner shows when we, in the next video, when we talk about the challenges of the last 15 years in the social conservative Islamist parties. This is also one of the bones of contention between them. Here you see a painting of a picture of the Turkish National Airlines, Türk Hava Yolları, THY, which for many years used to be among travelers, they hate you. So the abbreviation was used because it was such a dreadful airline. And the state still owns slightly less than 50% in this airline, but it has now been partially privatized, and it has, in the last 15 years, experienced an enormous expansion, both in quality and in range and in modernization, and is now generally deemed as one of the best airlines, generally featuring very highly on customer satisfaction forms and so on. So here we see this principle of statism has been explicitly rejected by the new Islamist or social conservative parties that have come to power in Turkey since 2002, and which, as you can easily imagine, brings them into conflict with those who had used to benefit from the role of the state in the economy. So, to briefly summarize, these 6 Kemalist principles were not initially in the Constitutional Compact of 1924, also not in the Amendment of 1928, but they were then given constitutional power or force in 1937 and have held this ever since. There have been some shifts in emphasis, but by and large, the Turkish Republic has bound itself to these 6 principles. And to briefly go over some of the most important reforms that have sprang from these 6 principles. Most of them are in the 1920s and 30s, and in the degree of the strength of their commitment and their willingness to actually transform society is they have set Turkey apart from all of the other Muslim nations. Even if you see in some of the other nations, some of these reforms being also taken up. And among the most important ones are some of them I've already mentioned, is the 1922, the abolition of the Sultanate. In 1923, the proclamation of a republic. In 1924, the abolition of the Caliphate. The 1923, through the Treaty of Lausanne, the assumption of firm borders of the Turkish Republic, and with that also the abolition of the capitulations, the unfair treaties imposed on the Ottoman Empire throughout centuries. Also in 1924, the abolition of Sharia courts and the replacement with a comprehensive state-run court system. Then in 1925, the abolition of the headgear that we just mentioned. In the same year, the abolition of the religious orders and the dervish lounges. In the same year, 1925, the introduction of the Gregorian calendar, replacing the Islamic calendar. In 1926, a new penal law modeled on the Italian penal law, so implicitly is abolishing Islamic penal regulations or stipulations. In the same year, as I mentioned, the introduction of a new civil code modeled on the Swiss civil code, basically just translating the Swiss civil code into Turkish law. In the same year, then you have an obligations law and a law of torts and a commercial law, which then replaced the Majalle that had been abolished earlier on, that we talked to earlier on. The 1928, the Turkish Educational Association, that is tasked with unifying educational system and therefore abolishing the role of the religious authorities in education. As I mentioned, in 1928, the adoption of a new Turkish alphabet based on the Latin script. The 1931, the creation of the Historical Association that we mentioned, and all this that follows from it for the creation of a usable past. In 1934, the law instituting family names. This is actually where Mustafa Kemal is then given by parliament the surname Atatürk, father of the Turks, as an honor. The later president of the Republic, İnönü, is given his last name in recognition of the seed of the battle he won against the Greeks and the War of Liberation. So this is the introduction of family laws is an important part of a modern administration because it allows you to classify and structure people. And it's a reform that has, for example, been taken up by Iran around roughly the same point. In 1934, also the introduction of full political rights, both passive and active, for women. A first in the Muslim world, earlier than some of the Christian European countries. And last but certainly not least, in 1937, the formal commitment of the state to secularism in the constitution. So these reforms really succeeded in transforming state and society based on the 6 Kemalist principles. So are there any problems with Kemalism as a political ideology? Well, as we discussed in the last video, there are some problems with the personality cult that has sprung up around Atatürk and his image. There are some problems with respect to liberalism and the freedom to discuss certain aspects of Turkish history that we also discussed in the last video. But perhaps the most important problem with Kemalism is the role of the armed forces in politics, something that has affected quite dramatically the outside perception of Turkey as a truly modern state, as we see here in the 1980 Newsweek cover about the coup d'etat at the time. The army has always enjoyed a very prominent role in Turkish politics, in the Turkish Republic. And as we discussed in the last video, that is premised on the very strong political capital that the leaders of the War of Liberation enjoyed after the successful prosecution of the war, and the way that they were able to repel the Allied invasion after the World War I. So the army sees itself and has been given particular constitutional recognition of that role. It sees itself as the guardian of Kemalism. In particular, the guardian of the continued progress along a modern secular nationalist state. So whenever they felt these principles were in danger, they interfered in politics. And they did this for the first time in 1960, where they deposed the civilian government and actually executed the civilian government at the time. And they returned power to different civilians shortly afterwards, but that was the first iteration. And from then on, it was clear to everybody involved in Turkish politics that they were watched. And in 1971, the army interfered again at a time of great political turmoil in Turkey. So actually, that was a coup that perhaps was welcomed by some relatively large parts of the population, but it was also quite bloody. And the army stayed in power for about 2 years reinstigating martial law as they saw fit during this 2-year period. In 1980, the army staged their third full-fledged coup d'etat, which is now a very bloody affair and leading to a large exodus of many Turks into Western Europe as asylum seekers. The army now stays in power till 1983. This is the incidents that prompted the Newsweek cover that we have just seen. In 1997, you have the first, what one of the admirals involved called the first postmodern coup. The army actually did not have to stage a full-fledged coup. They simply issued a memorandum to the civilian authorities saying, these are our demands, you better follow them, otherwise we take you off. And their demands were met. You have in 2007 a similar statement being issued by the army to the now Islamist government, saying that the army sees itself as an active participant in the political discourse of Turkey, and they will not allow the Kemalist principles, in particular secularism, to be endangered by the politicians, and showing to the politicians that they are being watched. And as you can easily see, this is a role of the armed forces that is at odds with the way, particularly the European Union, sees its ideal form of social arrangements among its member states. And as we will discuss in the next videos, this is one of the strongest bones of contention that is holding up has held up the accession process. But as the trials, the very publicized trials from 2010 till 2012, were for the first time in Turkish history, alleged conspirators of an alleged 2003 coup d'etat of the army were actually put on trial and convicted, including some very high-ranking generals. So there was an alleged 2003 coup d'etat by the army, and it was now discovered. And in 2010 till 2012, in very high-profile court cases, these conspirators in the armed forces were convicted. So we see now a shift to stronger civilian control of the armed forces. But it remains one of the issues that occupy our interest.